Hello, everyone. Welcome back to another live stream. Thank you so much for tuning in for another show. Welcome to all of our members, subscribers, new and old, from all across the world tuning in for another live stream. If you're new to this channel, I have these live streams regularly for more in-depth talk and analysis. If you prefer shorter videos, you can go ahead to my video tab and check that out. I posted a video earlier on today about a couple of updates. One of them was Trump's position when it comes to the ceasefire and him exerting some pressure on Benjamin Netanyahu and trying to play a part to reach a ceasefire. We haven't had elaboration on that. Netanyahu's office denied it. They denied that Donald Trump spoke to him and told him about the ceasefire. But Benjamin Netanyahu has been receiving calls from multiple leaders across the world. And they're trying to make it work without Hamas. They're trying to make it work without Hamas with the ceasefire talks today in Doha that are supposed to take 2 days. So who's talking? Egypt, Qatar, the United States, and Israel. Israel claimed that Hamas has representation in Qatar. Of course they do. They have an office in Qatar. However, they said they're not coming to the negotiations. That means any decisions that need to be made, any talks, will have to be presented to Hamas outside of them being in the negotiation. So you will have some of the mediators going to them, telling them, look, they met, I know you didn't participate, but here's what they have to offer. What is acceptable by Hamas is Joe Biden's proposal that said ceasefire, and a confirmation from Israel that they will continue the ceasefire if they do not agree on phase 2 following the end of phase 1, because we're talking about a 3-stage or 3-phase ceasefire process. Hamas had this condition as one of the key things to continue the ceasefire. Why? Because they can call it a ceasefire, a permanent ceasefire then, and they will not be back to the same situation that they were in the temporary ceasefire, where Israel can say at any point, oh, we want to reignite the war, just like Yoav Gallant did after the temporary ceasefire finished, without continuing it, because in that agreement, they had an understanding that they can continue the ceasefire for multiple days at a time, with an exchange of a few Palestinian prisoners for several Israeli prisoners who are in Gaza. Hamas didn't want to go and fall into that trap again, and they wanted security for the Palestinian people, of course, because it's the Palestinian people who are going through genocide, not the Israeli people. Now, they haven't confirmed anything, and we had reports that these negotiations will also take place tomorrow. They will also take place tomorrow. That video also spoke about the things that Mohammed bin Salman supposedly said about him being under threat if he reaches a ceasefire deal and a peace treaty with Israel, and he meets the same fate of the late Egyptian President Anwar al-Sadat after he had a peace treaty with Israel following the Liberation War, where Israel got Sinai back following Israeli occupation. And that's a very important thing for people to remember here, that you're talking about an expansionist, neo-colonialist, reckless entity that wants more territories. When they used to occupy Sinai, they didn't plan to leave Sinai up until they were met with force. Likewise with Lebanon, they did not leave Lebanon up until they were met with force. Similarly with Gaza. Now, he's saying that he is under threat if he has deal with Israel. And I also spoke about the statement from Abu Ubaidah, the spokesperson of Al-Qassam brigades, elaborating further on the Israeli prisoner who was killed. And you can go ahead and watch that video after this live stream if you haven't watched it so far. The talk is still, okay, what's happening with the response, everyone? What? You're all talk, no action. What's happening? Everyone is waiting. We had more clarification today from the Houthi leader, Ansarullah Abdul Malik al-Houthi. He had a speech today that I wanted to share parts of it with you, and he elaborated further on the response, the type of response, and who will be participating. Now, we said previously, when Iran was speaking about a response, they said that we will respond. We will respond. There were hints about other participation. Hezbollah said, we will either respond on our own or we will have a coordinated attack with the resistance fronts. But Yemen always confirmed, and they reaffirmed today, that it will be all the supporting fronts attacking Israel, and that this response is absolute. So I'm going to share some of the details of the speech with you, and then I wanted to talk to you about the subject that I briefly spoke about yesterday, the report on MahmoodOD, when it comes to the economic situation in Israel, the economic collapse of the state of Israel. With regards to Abdul Malik al-Houthi, Abdul Malik al-Houthi, he said a couple of things. He had quite a long speech. Of course, I'm not going to share all of it with you. I'm just going to try and share the most relevant parts with you. And as usual, after I share these things with you, I will open the space up for the community for your participation. So if you have anything for me, if you don't mind, leave it up until we finish with the subjects, and then you can save it for that, so I wouldn't miss most of your responses and communication with me. The leader of Ansarullah, Sayyid Abdul Malik al-Houthi, stressed that the steadfastness of the Palestinian people in the Gaza Strip, despite the genocide, displacement, starvation, mass exodus, and repeated declarations of military zones, is a great lesson for the entire nation. In a speech he delivered on Thursday, Mr. Houthi criticized the Islamic position in general, stressing that if hundreds of millions of negligent Muslims have moved according to their responsibility, the crimes would have stopped and the reality of the Palestinian people would have changed. He stressed that the Fajr massacre, or the Dawn massacre, was one of the most heinous of the enemy's crimes during the past week through targeting worshippers in a Tabi'een school with American bombs. The leader of Ansarullah pointed out that a group of Arab regimes are moving with all their might. Now, he opened fire on some of the Arab governments. He said they are moving with all their might to provide military protection for the enemy and intercept the missiles or drones that targeted, while Arab media outlets have turned into platforms to justify the crimes of the Israeli enemy and to provide moral guidance in its interest and direct the language of defiance to the nation. Regarding the decision of the resistance to respond to the crimes of the occupation, Al-Houthi stressed that the decision to respond from the fronts of Jerusalem struggle and resistance, as he described them, to the crimes of the enemy is inevitable, and that no matter what efforts to contain the response are, they are a failure, and the decision is inevitable from all support fronts. This is one of the biggest clarifications so far, although we had similar clarifications from Iran and from Hezbollah too, that a decision, a response is coming whether or not there's a ceasefire agreement. And again, that could be stemming from a deep-rooted understanding of these movements, of the nature of Israel and the US administration. Why? Because they always talk. Amos Hochstein was in Lebanon again. He spoke with Nabih Berri, the mediator that's supposed to be the link between them and Hezbollah. He started to act like, I'm not coming with threats, and if I say any of the threats, they're coming from Israel, as if he's like just a messenger, just a mediator. Hezbollah responded that it's just a show. They said Hochstein is coming to Lebanon as a show. They're not coming with significant stuff. Why? Because they know the score. You're not talking about people who get fooled by talk. They don't fall for this talk stuff. People have been talking for decades. Nothing has been happening apart from an expansion of the criminality and barbarism of this death cult of a regime in Israel. The leader of Ansarullah movement said that the US administration are making it difficult to contain the response through political steps, including talking about dialogue and negotiations and warning against influencing them. However, he stressed that the American naval forces mobilization and the arrival of aircraft to American bases in Arab countries cannot cancel the decision to respond. He pointed out that despite the skeptical media coverage by the enemies, as he described them, the response is definitely coming, and he repeated it twice, coming, coming. In this context, the leader of Ansarullah movement stressed that the response of the enemy is decisive. There is no going back at all. It is a sincere commitment from honest people who have been tested in their honesty in word and deed, and it is a practical necessity to deter the enemy. So they're not just looking at it from a perspective of their obligation towards Gaza and the Palestinian people, and the fact that no one is supporting the Palestinian people in action apart from the resistance fronts. And when we say action, by actively doing something, not just, sending aid or condemning what Israel is doing. And the deterrence part is also important, because Israel, when they carry out these attacks, they are used to carrying out attacks with impunity. And again, when we talk about this war specifically, this war changed many of the things that people took as a given in Israel. Previously, the philosophy of war and strikes in Israel is usually strike your enemy in a very fast, decisive strike in enemy territory, get the job over and done with quickly, and go back with no casualties, ideally, or with the least damage as possible. And that has been turned upside down, because 7th of October was inside of the Israeli territory. What Hezbollah are conducted inside of Israeli territory. The mass exodus is happening in Israel. The economic devastation is happening in Israel. The high alertness is happening in Israel. So where you have an effect on the sides that Israel is attacking, they are receiving similar, if not greater, response when it comes to the overall effect. It's not a response that comes anywhere close to the barbaric destruction that Israel is committing against civilian targets and the civilian population in Gaza. However, in the grand scheme of things, when we talk about it from Israel overall as a state, as a society, as the economy, as the political level, as the military level, all of these things have been hurt severely. And Ansarullah understand that alongside the resistance fronts. He continued regarding the delay in the response. He pointed out that the delay comes in a practical context so that the response would be painful to the enemy and in response to the American state of alert to hinder it, stressing that this delay has a practical impact on the enemy. And it has never been in such a stage of fear, such as canceling flights. That's 100% correct. When it comes to the alertness, the high alertness, the preparedness in Israel, how much they're frightened from this response and how much it's costing them heavily. In his speech, the leader of Ansarullah movement spoke about the Gaza support front, stressing that the Lebanese support front is continuing strongly in its escalating operations that are affecting the enemies. And when it comes to Hezbollah's escalating operations, I wanted to point this out before I continue. They are increasing the range day by day without calling it or labeling it as the response. 3 weeks ago, and that's a pattern that we have seen from Lebanon, they have been constantly going deeper and deeper into Israeli territory. It's a tactical move from them. They do it in a very calculated manner, but they're constantly going deeper. The big problem with them going deeper, but not going all out, not as a response to the assassination of Fuad Shukr, but as a response to the daily enemy to enemy actions between them and Israel, is the fact that these areas 5 kilometers inwards in Israel, they are not labeled as emergency areas who received evacuation orders, nor do they receive state funds to compensate for anything, any financial losses, any business losses, or to cover the expenses of the people who want to leave. So the government declared that, if I'm not mistaken, it's just about 5 kilometers from the border, 5 to 8 kilometers from the borders with Lebanon. They declared all of these zones battle zones, and they said that every single person living in these places and is going out, we will take care of their stay, we'll keep them in hotels, and we will help them financially. They tried to delay that at one point. People are still complaining with all of the support, but 1 meter outside this 5 kilometer zone and you don't get support, and that causes a lot of problems when it comes to the Israeli public. And there are many calls to increase this radius, but again, Benjamin Netanyahu does not care about that. He pointed out that in the media field, there are video scenes that witness the effectiveness of the operation of the support front in Lebanon and their impact. The entire enemy entity is in a state of panic and fear, and its media is talking about that, and its reality, and it's witnessing it, and the repercussions are present. While referring to the great Zionist fear and anxiety of Hezbollah's response, stressing that they are taking the response into account 1,000 times, because they expect it to be a very painful and influential response. Regarding the Yemeni front, the leader of Ansarullah movement announced that the operations carried out by Yemen against ships this week used 15 ballistic missiles and winged missiles and a drone, while confirming that the operations are still ongoing. In contrast, he pointed out that the hostile American raids this week amounted to 10 raids, including 8 in Hudaydah and 2 in Hajjah and Sana'a. Regarding Yemeni support for Palestine, Al-Houthi said that the Yemeni people are moving through military mobilization activities in most governorates, stressing that there are more than 400,000 graduates of military courses, in addition to hundreds of military activities and parades. He was trying to point out the level of preparedness when it comes to a potential invasion in Yemen, something that Israel did not rule out, but the United States does not want. The leader of Ansarullah added that the Yemeni people have no hesitation in anything they can do to support Palestine, stressing that as long as the aggression against the Palestinian people and the siege continue, the Yemenis will continue their military operations and popular activities as a sacred struggle mission. Al-Houthi stressed the inevitability of response to the Israeli aggression on Hudaydah, saying the response is definitely coming, and it has its own path, preparations, tactics, and capabilities. That was the statement from the Ansarullah leader Abdul Malik al-Houthi, clearly saying that you're talking about a response that's coming. The delay is based on calculations. It's going to be all out. It's going to be very painful, and they are taking everything into consideration. However, it's definitely coming. The second thing that I want to talk to you about, and I won't be too long on you before I open the space for everyone, is the economic devastation when it comes to Israel, with a report that was published recently on Mondo Waste. Now, before I go into this report, I'd like to stress out that Israel is very shady about the economic losses, although there have been many things that were unprecedented in Israel economically. First and foremost, we had very suspicious stock movements in Israel before the 7th of October that we spoke about at the time 10 months ago. One of them was from one of the largest banks in Israel called Bank Leumi. They made trades worth hundreds of millions of dollars. You're talking about approximately 600 million. Very suspicious, and they had no reason to do that. Okay, they made a profit on these financial moves after the 7th of October because they knew something was coming, and it's very typical and is an indication that the state of Israel, yet another indication from many indications, that they had prior knowledge about the 7th of October, and that's not something that Israel does on its own. Many financially related people, financially linked people who are worried about their finances, who know what's happening, and are tied with the political class, do these things, especially when it comes to certain stocks. If you know that a certain stocks is going to collapse and a war is about to happen, you sell everything and then you buy them low to make more gains afterwards. And that's what they've done inside of Israel. But again, all of that is covered by the screaming, the shouting, the scenes and everything, and the war, so that no one looks into it and investigates it for potential corruption and what have you. Even when it comes to the investigation about the failure and potential prior knowledge, although many people released evidence in Israel, including people from the army, about prior knowledge, the fact that they warned their commanders and no action was taken from the political level, Israel keeps it at a low, and anything they call an investigation is a pseudo investigation. It's not a real investigation, because they don't want the truth to come out, because that would collapse everything more than it's already even collapsed. So the report in MahmoodOD spoke about a couple of things. I again wanted to share the highlights with you. The economic indicators speak of nothing less than an economic catastrophe. Over 46,000 businesses have gone bankrupt. This is in the words of MahmoodOD. Tourism has stopped, Israel's credit rating is lowered, and Israeli bonds are sold at the price of almost junk bond levels. And the foreign investments have already dropped by 60% in the first quarter of 2023 as a result of the policies of Israel's far-right government before October the 7th show no prospects of recovery. The majority of the money invested in Israel investment funds was diverted to investments abroad because Israelis do not want their pension funds and insurance funds or their own savings to be tied to the fate of the state of Israel. This caused a surprising stability in the Israeli stock market because funds invested in foreign stocks and bonds generated profit in foreign currency, which is multiplied by the rise in the exchange rate between foreign currencies and the Israeli shekel. But then Intel scuttled a $25 billion investment plan in Israel, the biggest BDS victory ever. These are all financial indicators, but the crisis strikes deeper at the means of production of the Israeli economy. Israel's power grid, which has largely switched to natural gas, still depends on coal to supply demand. The biggest supplier of coal in Israel is Colombia, which announced that it would suspend coal shipments to Israel as long as the genocide was ongoing. After Colombia, the next two biggest suppliers are South Africa and Russia. Without reliable and continuous electricity, Israel will no longer be able to pretend to be a developed economy. Server farms do not work without a 24-hour power, and no one knows how many blackouts the Israeli high-tech sector could potentially survive. International tech companies have already started closing their branches in Israel. Israel's reputation as a startup nation depends on its tech sector, which in return depends on highly educated employees. Israeli academics report that joint research with universities abroad has declined sharply thanks to the efforts of student encampments. Israeli newspapers are full of articles about the exodus of educated Israelis. Professor Dan Ben David, a famous economist, argued that the Israeli economy is held together by 300,000 people. The senior staff in universities, tech companies, and hospitals. Once a significant portion of these people leaves, he says, we won't become a third world country. We just won't become any more. And they added with more details, but I just wanted to point out some of these things to you. That's, of course, apart from the degrading that we had from Moody's previously, which was very, very significant, and the fact that they had a very negative projection about Israel, meaning they are not seeing any pattern of improvement when it comes to Israel. These rating agencies, they had problems with Israel when they had the judicial reform, because when they rate a country, they also look at the political and social stability. They already warned Israel. Many people inside of Israel warned the government from what they're doing as well. But of course, it's led by Benjamin Netanyahu. And funny enough, the finance minister, Smotrich, who denies these things and acts like he's blind and arrogant. Like with Moody's, he only criticized the fact that they didn't call Hamas and Hezbollah terrorist organizations and disregarded what they're talking about in the actual rating. It's like, think in your head for a second, these countries, they want stability. And again, many companies in Israel, billions, right? Billions worth, they took their money out. And many Israeli-based companies that are not linked with multinational companies necessarily in terms of the board and the people who control them, they pushed their funds outside of Israel, talking about billions. Add to that the fact that for the first time in history, Israel had to dig into its reserves, the Bank of Israel's reserves, for the first time in history. All of these, and the fact that it's viewed as a pariah state, a war criminal. You have the ICC at least saying that they're going to issue an arrest warrant. All of these things are indicators for collapse, let alone the manufacturing inside of Israel, especially when you talk about the fact that the most hard-hit areas were areas surrounding Gaza and the Lebanese borders. When you talk about the Galilee and Gaza combined, they run over 80% of what Israel requires in terms of manufacturing, in terms of farms, in terms of industries, and not just related to farming, tech industries as well, let alone the economic losses when it comes to the military, okay? We're just talking about pure economics here without involving the military. If you want to involve the military, but hey, when it comes to the, military, we're getting 20 billion like that from the United States, right? The Federal Reserve in the United States is controlled by private people. Some people in America think it's like it belongs to the nation. It doesn't belong to you. America is a company. The United States is a company. The population is viewed as material, as products, right? Only thing left is just to put a tag on you, right? Behind of your back like that to scan you. This is how they use the people. And this is what I wanted to share with you in this live stream. Let me open the space up for all of your participation. Again, thank you so much, everyone, for joining me, all of the members, subscribers, and everyone else. Before I begin, thank you so much for Z UK and for Gulnara for your supers. Z is saying, sad for the West, have to accept the trash they threw out in 48. Netanyahu's hood is being ethnically cleansed. Of Israel's plan implodes. Well, I mean, we can sit down and talk about that for hours, can't we? At the end of the day, when you talk about the controlling elite in Europe in particular, they were the ones who said, the Jewish question was a question raised in Europe by the elites in Europe, right? And when they wanted to find a final solution to the Jewish question, as they labeled it, you had Zionism on the rise simultaneously. And they found that solution by Zionism and, hey, Nazism too, who collaborated. Read about the Avara agreement and read about the collaboration. And of course, we started to hear about the term anti-Semitism instead of anti-Judaism to link these people to a land, to criminalize the criticism of the land, rather than as if it's not a valid criticization, right? Criticism, for any state. Right, Studio Rainer as well. Thank you so much for your super. You said, how do you think MBS will handle the West if the West really intended to kill him? Interesting. That's in relation to the previous video where I quoted an article coming from the Politico saying that MBS is worried about being assassinated if he has a peace treaty with Israel. Look, Saudi Arabia, they have a lot of leverage. They have a lot of leverage when it comes to the oil, right? And money and lots of economic economic aspects when it comes to Saudi Arabia. That's part of the reason, or at least part of the reason, that they declare that they are having these approaches when it comes to the Middle East. Listen, these people, at the end of the day, they don't want headache. They just want their economy to be fine. They don't want wars. They don't want all these. They just want business to go ahead, drag more investments. This man has a vision of 2030. He wants to have more investments. He has this Neon campaign, all of these lavish campaigns, trying to make Saudi Arabia as a tourist hub. And he doesn't want any of that. However, I think, the talk about potential assassination, before any talk about anyone from outside of Saudi Arabia wanting to do that, you need to look at it internally. Ever since his rise, we had many feuds in the ruling family, to a level where the United States, I think it was the Central Command at one point, they had to interfere. They had to interfere to take the tensions down. Why? There were gunshots, there was fire, right? And we had these mass imprisonments that he had, and taking money and what have you. So I think the problems are internally. Of course, when it comes to imprisoning people, lack of freedoms, all of these things, before you talk about abroad. So as far as the United States is concerned, they're of course worried about the Chinese influence and the increasing ties that are coming between China and Saudi Arabia, and Russia and Saudi Arabia too. But the main thing for them is that do not take certain steps that will make life more difficult for us. The United States does not want anyone making life more difficult for them. And I don't necessarily think that Saudi Arabia is making life more difficult for them. If there was one of these countries who's more aligned with Western countries that gave some sort of a headache, it would be Egypt. Why? Because Egypt, although of course they didn't participate in defending the Palestinian people, they did not allow the ethnic cleansing campaign to happen in the beginning. Why? Because the United States, European governments, listen, everyone, all of the political elite in Europe and the United States, most of them, they were applying pressure coordinated with Israel to the fullest extent on Egypt to open the borders completely and allow an influx of Palestinians and get rid of them. For Israel to complete the ethnic cleansing campaign, but Egypt stood firm at the time when they said, we're not doing that because we know what's coming. The Palestinian people, they are people who will continue to fight, and if they continue to fight from Sinai, Israel will use that as a pretext to attack Sinai. If they attack Israel from Sinai, Egypt as a country will be liable. That will be used as a justification to attack Egypt, and they don't want that. Okay? So that happened more from a country like Egypt rather than Saudi Arabia, and I hope that elaborates. Thank you so much for that. And Gullyberg, thank you so much for your super said, are there any updates on the military buildup in the northern border with Lebanon? Well, they built up what they can build up. They had Division 36 from 6 months ago. As soon as they took Division 36 out of Gaza, they deployed it in Lebanon. They introduced more reservists to Lebanon. They stopped giving people breaks from the army reservists and started to train them on mountainous terrain, including in Cyprus, to go and participate in Lebanon. Golan is already there, the brigade that's supposedly most experienced when it comes to Lebanon, who, funny enough, were beaten to death when they invaded Lebanon. And they had 2 invasion attempts in the past 10 months, if you don't remember. We spoke about them each time respectively. And they were crushed down by Hezbollah, right? Because you're talking about the natives of the land, people who are actually the natives, against people who are not the natives of the land. And Hezbollah, of course, they have a very high level of preparation when it comes to Israel. Jimmy Eyes saying, why would the US be starting all the wars to steal oil if we had more under our feet? As Trump says, than other places. Sounds like we probably don't. Maybe we don't have that much. I think what Trump refers to is probably them having more under our feet, but the fact that it won't be completely aligned with the economic, climate-friendly ways that they extract this from, because if you want to extract gas and fuel and what have you, you're talking about a lot of resources. But still, despite that, greed has no boundaries, and the United States administration is the greediest administration in the world. So whenever there's something, they'll continue. How many times have they tried to have military coups now in Venezuela, one of the countries with the most oil reserves in the world, right? Suspecting and even blaming them of having a dictator when he's winning the democratic elections and trying to make these shows and stuff. Greed has no boundaries, unfortunately. And deep diver, what made Saudi wage an 80-year war against Yemen when MBS was looking to making Saudi like UAE? Was it a miscalculation on this? That's very interesting. Firstly, they were worried about the increasing ties that Yemen is having with Iran. That's number one. Their historical foe is Iran. And again, based on what? Based on constant trash talk, right? And these presumptions, right? And historical feuds, okay? And of course, there's sectarian issues. There are racist issues too. But a big part of it comes from the United States. And we had an example of that very recently, how when, and to my understanding, that has been dealt with now, when Ansarullah in Yemen. So in Yemen, for those of you who are not aware, we have two governments, one recognized internationally and one not recognized internationally, which is Ansarullah. Ansarullah said that they received threats from Saudi Arabia that we are going to have sanctions on the Bank of Sana'a, we're going to stop flights and what have you. Ansarullah started threatening them back. And what did they say? They said the United States is applying pressure on Saudi Arabia. Unfortunately, Saudi Arabia is falling into that trap. Why do I have an incline to believe that? It's because we just had a deal brokered with between Saudi Arabia and Iran that included Ansarullah just over a year ago by China and with mediation from Oman. That was a historic move. Not many people spoke about that. Israel didn't like it. The US didn't like it. Why? Because it was China trying to bring countries together. You see, that's the difference between countries who want stability and countries who want chaos, even if it's managed chaos or low-heat chaos. China really wants stability. So they had this historic agreement between Saudi Arabia and included Yemen, and it was resolved. But now things started to pop up again, up until they were, to my knowledge, resolved, unless something else popped up since then. I'm talking about that was 2-3 weeks ago, I think. So there is still pressure being applied from the United States, and the US pressure is very malicious. Is very malicious because they rely, their whole philosophy is divide and rule, right? Cause tensions, cause problems, sectarian problems. Think tanks in the US in the late 20th century used to say the 21st century will be the 100-year war between the Sunni and the Shia. This is what they want. Sectarian problems between Muslims. Of course, there are many problems to be solved in the Muslim world themselves, still calling Shia and Sunni and disregarding Islam as a whole, right? And following this poisonous approach that, firstly, their enemies encourage. Secondly, is baseless claims. Much of it, if not all of it, stemming from political feuds that are 1,400 years old. So China, of course, they tried to do that, but the United States, they still want these problems. And unfortunately, there are people in the Arab and Muslim world who are ignorant enough to fall for this trap and continue to talk about these things, and as if the Iran is this and Iran is that, and continue the problems. And Chris, putting Netanyahu aside and the other criminals, is not the Israeli infrastructure and armed settlers in the West Bank a major hurdle to bringing the Palestinian nation back to what it should be? Well, that's their purpose. Their purpose is to be there to prevent the potential of having a Palestinian statehood. And who allowed them to go there? Who was in power when they went there? And which part on the Palestinian side was sitting there and talking with Israel while this squatter establishment was being expanded in the West Bank? These are very important questions. You didn't always have Benjamin Netanyahu. You had governments that are more supposedly left-leaning in Israel. They still enabled this enterprise because they know what they're doing very well. They wanted to make it impossible for the Palestinians to have a state. How do they do that? By stealing. This is how they established the state. They stole it. They expelled the people. So they steal. This is a thief nation. So they did that. And unfortunately, on the Palestinian side, you had a Palestinian Authority, been talking to them for 30 years now. And again, if you look at it even from a business perspective, let's say you have a business and you're making business with someone and you're being promised certain returns in 3 to 4 years down the line. 3 to 4 years pass, 5, 6, 7 years, 8 years, 9 years, 10 years down the line, and you're losing and losing and losing. 30 years down the line, and they're expanding, you're losing. What does that all mean? That means that the formula is corrupt. The formula is poison, okay? As a matter of fact, the man who started these negotiations, Yasser Arafat himself, people reported that he said we were deceived with the Oslo negotiations, and they continued. All of that is meant for making it impossible as much as possible to have a Palestinian state. Now it's out of the question. You see, that's the thing here. We have all of this talk and all of these negotiations as if there's someone to talk to in Israel. In Israel, it's almost a consensus of not having a Palestinian state. They just passed a law in the Israeli Knesset. 90% voted for, right? Apart from a very fractional minority that have no relevance when it comes to decision making in Israel, that we should not have a Palestinian state next to us. What does that tell you? See, that's the funny thing. These people in power in Israel, they want a one-state solution. I advocate for a one-state solution, but I advocate for a democratic one-state solution, equal rights between the Jordan River to the sea, regardless of your race and ethnicity, rights for everyone, one man, one vote. They want a one state of ethnocracy, of Jewish supremacy, right? Of a squatter enterprise, right? People below them, Class A and Class B or Class Z citizens, right? They want that. And this is what the government is working for. And if they had their way and they haven't faced resistance from Gaza, and we didn't have these supporting fronts for Gaza, but primarily the people of Gaza surviving this, getting through this, and the resistance remaining powerful and steadfast and still facing them, they would have had that. And you would have seen settlements. And of course, if Egypt enabled them, for example, to open the borders, you would have seen settlements. Why? Because they have plans. Daniela Weiss, one of the squatting establishment leaders, one of the grand thieves, she revealed in an interview over half a year ago that they already had development plans. We want sea view. There is no sea view in the West Bank. The West Bank is beautiful, but it's mountains and valleys, but they don't have sea view. So the squatter establishment wanted sea view over the bodies and body parts of infants. They wouldn't mind, having infants and pieces of human flesh underneath them from these massacres that they committed. They're fine with that. And to have a sea view over a couple of hundred people beneath them. And let's go to your next one. Thank you so much, everyone, for your participation. Apologies if I'm missing some of your questions. Let's see where we reached. A white Nubian king is saying Chinese are enslaving the Uyghurs, but you think they're going to help you. Well, it's not about thinking or not thinking that they're going to help you or us or them or whoever it is. It's about reading what's actually happening on the geopolitical scene. When we talk about Russia and China, firstly, that doesn't mean we endorse any of these governments or these people. We talk about what's actually happening. And with regards to what's happening internally. Let's say, for example, with the Uyghurs, and we had many statements from people suffering things and saying things that are beyond atrocious with the Uyghur community. We are still getting most of the information from Western sources, and Western sources are the least reliable sources. Western mainstream media are the least reliable sources. And another question we should be asking ourselves here when we talk about those, and when I talk about certain suffering, I'm talking about people who I personally researched and read about, who had their certain statements coming out. There's something. And again, you're talking about a very hardline atheist state. It's not only the Uyghurs suffering there. All religions complain. Buddhists complain, and Christians complain in China. It's not like it's restricted to the Uyghur community. That doesn't make it more beautiful, right? But again, we are people who call for equal human rights unequivocally with moral consistency. Now, when it comes to, and that's something that everyone should question here, why would mainstream media, wherever it's coming from Western parts, from Arab, from Muslim organization, wherever it is, ignoring the slaughter of over 40,000 people, ignoring a genocide and infanticide and covering up for a criminal, blatant, broad daylight, people documenting their own genocide. Why would they all of a sudden start to have sympathy with the Uyghur community in China? Is it because they have a problem with China? Is it because China is a rising power? Is it because China is threatening their hegemony and their unilateral approach when it comes to the world and using people as material, right? All of these questions are questions we should be asking ourselves when we talk about any country. Right. And I think that applies with China. Likewise, look at them when they talk about other countries that they don't like. Look at them when they talk about Iran. One protester being scratched. Oh my God, Iran, they don't respect women. And they start crying. A dog loses its paw and they call for a regime change. Right, because it's a country that doesn't respect animal rights, okay? But the slaughter of infants, people chopped, children, infants chopped every single day in Gaza, they turn a blind eye. Do you want me to believe them? No, thank you so much. I don't believe them. I will have my own research on China and I will make a very well-informed decision, but not based on people who constantly lie and who have a track record of lying, all of a sudden showing sympathy with the Uyghur community. Why don't you show sympathy with the Palestinian people of Gaza then, right? Why the double standards? Whenever the US administration supports someone, question it. Whenever these elite governments support a group of people, question it. Of course, that doesn't mean you need to deny it or act like it's not happening, or question it. What's happening? Why is it happening? And I hope that elaborates. And Beizai, why are Palestinians always fall for Israel-US tricks when negotiating? Remember, Arafat was fooled, Abbas fooled, and Hamas fooled with first ceasefire recently. That's a very interesting and on-point question. It's because, and that's not restricted to the Palestinian case. Traditionally, when you look at the national liberation movements across the world, you would see a certain pattern with some of them, not all of them, with some of them, okay? That the people who showed fierceness in their, for example, armed resistance or strive for liberation, for their struggle, all of a sudden, when it comes to trying to get the fruits out of their struggle and we talk about politics, they fail. Why? Because they haven't enjoyed political freedom. They don't have experience in politics. Therefore, they fail when it comes to getting the rewards politically. Now, saying that, I will also not take what you said to the fullest content of what you mean. Why? Because if you talk about the Hamas case, they've learned with the years. Like if we talk about 2014, for example, they forced Israel to do many things. Firstly, withdraw completely from Gaza. Israel wanted to have a buffer zone. They pushed them from the buffer zone and they could reach anywhere, therefore having more land, more farms. They also forced Israel to allow them, and again, this is the situation of the Palestinian people, to be able to fish 3 kilometers in the sea. Israel didn't want to allow them to go 200-300 meters in the sea. They enforced that on them. They learned with time. The fact that they're not in the negotiations today shows you that they learned from their previous mistakes. The fact that they didn't enter a second ceasefire for 10 months in or 8 months after the first ceasefire shows you that there is a pattern, a learning curve. And again, when you talk about these people make mistakes and they learn from their mistakes. We see a pattern of them understanding more and more. And the fact that they just chose Yahya Sinwar as the leader of Hamas shows you exactly where they're going. Why? Because he is the man who understands Israel the most. It's Yahya Sinwar. That's why Israel was in a shock mode when Yahya Sinwar was elected as the Hamas leader. You know, you have all of these supposed, Arab specialists in Israel saying names here and there are internal conflicts and we're not sure, only to have a smack across their face by a consensus of 50 people out of 50 in the Shura Council of Hamas saying Yahya Sinwar is the leader. Right, a slap across their face. You took down the negotiator Ismail Haniyeh, he had some sort of leniency, but you brought Yahya Sinwar. Yahya Sinwar spent 24 years in Israeli prisons, during which he interacted with Israelis, spoke with Israeli media. He read about Israel's history, Israel's present. He read about biographies of previous presidents, prime ministers of Israel, leaders of Israel. He knows the Israeli psyche. He knows how they work. Right? So all of these things signal that we are seeing a pattern. And of course, again, when you talk about these moves, you need to remember that these mistakes were very common. But again, these movements learn from their mistakes to try and reap the rewards of their struggle. That's why we heard the term that Israel will not reap political rewards where they failed militarily. We heard that both from Hamas and from Hezbollah. They told them, what you haven't obtained with war, do not think you will obtain that with politics. Deep diver, what do you make of Mahmoud Abbas' visit to Turkey? What is the purpose of this trip and what can be actually achieved? Well, we heard the statements coming from the Palestinian President Mahmoud Abbas. He said that I am going back to Gaza. I'm willing to sacrifice, and people need to open the way. It's victory or martyrdom from the Palestinian president. And with regards to his recent visits in Moscow and in Turkey, he most likely was talking about the potential day after. These visits came just a few days after, 1 or 2 days before ceasefire talks, and behind closed doors. That's where 95% of the things that are not spoken about in the media happen. The prospect, what's going to happen? Are you going to go? Are you not going to go? Are Hamas going to take control? Are we going to have a democratic election? Is Israel potentially going to agree to this? Is Israel going to potentially agree to that? And again, these are normal visits that they conduct on a regular basis, whether it's with Turkey or with anyone else. That was from Deep Diver. And the Alchemist as well, thank you so much. Said, look at us in America, we're being targeted 24/7. Is that in reference to the media? I'm sorry if I didn't understand that, but thank you so much for your super. Iran plans, Mahmoud, Middle East Eye just posted a video of 6 different kind of rabbis criticize the government by going to the Temple Mount. They call them thugs and despicable. Yes, and they haven't said anything new. The religious leadership in Israel, regardless of how tied and how much they have faith in Zionism, and again, many of the religious leaders in Israel, they have this relationship with the state as a relationship of convenience. They criticize Israel for being a secular state, not being Jewish enough. There's always this talk about a religious versus secular state in Israel. However, that's becoming very normal from them. And Israel is trying to send a message to not escalate, right? And again, it's acts, it's pretend talk, because at the end of the day, you enabled Itamar Ben-Gvir and these squatters, these people, abhorrent racist squatters, going to the Al-Aqsa compound and to provoke the people. Many times they start swearing at them and criticize, Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him. Hideous stuff. They go spit at churches when they walk. I'm telling you, the depravity at the highest levels. So, they're trying to tone it down. But again, we all know the score. We all know the score. Dennis, thank you so much. Said Israel wants no state next to it. No Palestine, no Lebanon, no Syria, no Egypt, no Iraq, only USA. Interesting. Look, they are an expansionist entity. They occupied Sinai before. In the past 10 months, they attacked 5 countries. Four or 5 countries. And they attack them regularly. They constantly have attacks and constantly breach the airspace of other countries and attack and kill people and scientists in Iran and in other Arab states. This is how they are. This is how they operate. And again, this behavior is enabled by the elite governments in Western countries, and to a very large extent, the Arab countries too, the governments of many Arab countries as well. And that was, let's see if we have anything else before we wrap up. And Ahmed K, thank you so much for your super, much appreciated. Let's see. Anything else? No, that looks like it. Okay. Cool. Okay, guys, thank you so much for tuning in for another show. We'll wrap it up there. Like I said, for those of you who haven't watched my previous video, you can go ahead and watch it now on my video tab. I'll hopefully be with you tomorrow evening. Thank you so much for everyone who participated, and apologies if I missed some of your comments. Thank you so much for everyone who sent supers. Much appreciated. Really, really appreciate your support. Z, Gulnara Studio, The Virus, Gullyberg, Andrew, The Alchemist Studio, The Alchemist again, Dennis Huggins, and Ahmed K. Thank you so much for your contribution. Much appreciated. Apart from that, stay blessed, everyone. I hope you enjoyed this live stream as much as I did. I'll hopefully be with you tomorrow. Take care, stay safe, stay blessed. Peace, everyone. Salam.